much, Tim, and thank you for inviting us to come and present some of our work. So I am just going to share my screen. Cool. So just to give a brief background on the Centre for Data Ethics and Innovation. So we're an advisory body to government, and we have an independent board of experts. We were set up about 3 years ago by national government to maximise the benefits of data and AI for society and the economy. And we've been working in partnership with public sector organisations over the last year or so, and a particular area of focus for us has been local government. So in terms of the objectives for this seminar, we'll basically be presenting our draft guidance and work so far. We're really keen to get input and feedback from you, so on whether, or just your thoughts on our approach, the guidance itself, and some of the key details that we're exploring. And we're also keen to understand which issues or areas you'll find most useful to know more about, and that we might be able to present in seminars or work together on in the future. So a quick agenda. I'll be setting the scene, so giving a bit of an overview and background to the project. I'll hand over to Dave, who will give a summary of our work on the guidance, and there'll be an opportunity for questions to be asked here. We'll then move into breakout room discussions, so kind of getting your thoughts on the guidance, what you like about it and how it could be improved. And then we'll feed back as a group, so spending the last 15 minutes doing that, and then finally closing. And as Tim said, we will be running a series of polls during the session, and results are kind of shared instantly, so we can discuss those or we can discuss later in the breakout rooms. I think Tim is putting the Mentimeter link in the chat, so yeah, do click and get involved. Okay. Cool. So I'll just introduce our project. We're partnering with the Department of Education to develop guidance, which supports local authorities to understand how to develop and use data analytics responsibly in children's social care. There have been a few calls for national guidance. So the What Work Centre for Children's Social Care made this recommendation in their ethics review about a year and a half ago. We also made a similar recommendation in our review into algorithmic bias. We've heard the same from local government and individual local authorities as well. So the national guidance will basically develop a kind of coordinated approach to how we think about and understand ethics in this area, but there will be kind of sufficient flexibility to make sure that it's relevant for different local contexts, culture and governance as well. So this project builds on previous work that we've done on the use of data and algorithms in the public sector, and we'd be very happy to share this work if of interest. We published a report last year on addressing trust on the public sector's use of data, and highlighted opportunities for better uses of data. We also published a review into algorithmic bias last year, where we looked at the use of algorithms in local government. We've also worked in partnership over the last year with local authorities to better understand the challenges that they face when they use data and how they can innovate in a way that's deemed trustworthy. So this project kind of builds on these pieces of work. In terms of a definition of data analytics, it's always useful to provide this up front. So the way we're defining it is via these three categories, which are descriptive, analytics, diagnostic, and predictive. So descriptive can help explain what's happened in the past by kind of comparing how many times something's happened and how that's changed over time. Diagnostic analytics then helps to explain why things are happening. So by finding patterns and correlations in data that can indicate relationships. And then predictive analytics can estimate the likelihood of possible future outcomes. And so there are a number of different ways that these are and can be used in children's social care. The project itself is split into broadly 3 key parts. So the first is kind of a broad stakeholder engagement and research piece to better understand specific challenges in children's social care and risks and opportunities for the use of data analytics. The second part is working closely with local authorities across a range of different teams, from the frontline to senior leaders and data teams, as we draft and iterate the guidance. And this part is really important because we want the guidance to be practical and actually have kind of input from local authorities to make sure that it's valuable and useful. And then the final part is that we'll be reviewing the draft guidance and testing it, or aspects of it, on data analytics projects in children's social care. And so that will come kind of later in the year. But we're interested in any local authorities who would be keen to work with us to test it. And so in terms of our approach, just a couple of things that it's quite interesting to raise here. So we're kind of taking a risk-based approach, so considering how the riskiness of data analytics affects kind of the level of rigor and robustness that a local authority needs to demonstrate. And Dave will be taking us through some of that, all that thinking in a moment. And we're also identifying and developing good practice around things like mitigating bias, co-production with key stakeholders, and that can include kind of frontline social workers, as well as children and families. So yeah, here is a rough timeline. And I think moving to our first Mentimeter question. So this question is, do you support children's services in your day-to-day work? And the results should come up on the screen. Okay, interesting. Okay. Okay, cool. That's really interesting. So it sounds like some of you do. But yeah, hopefully this will still be relevant to work that you're doing elsewhere. And we're also really keen to hear about experiences that you've had in other areas of the local authority. Cool. Oh. I will move on to the next question, I think. I think it's broadly stopped. Okay, cool. So the next question is, have you ever developed data analytics in your local authority? So this includes for children's services, or it can be in another area. Okay, interesting. It's, again, sounds like lots of you have and might be doing that on quite a regular basis. I think that's definitely something that we'll be interested to pick up on in the discussions. It'd be interesting to see how and where you've developed data analytics and maybe some of the challenges that you faced. And then I think the final question, which maybe isn't so relevant now, considering that many of you have developed data analytics, is how comfortable or confident would you feel if you were asked to develop data analytics? So the first one is you'd feel more comfortable developing more basic types of data analytics. The second option is more advanced data analytics. The next one is you wouldn't feel comfortable. And then obviously you're allowed to not be sure. Cool. So this is quite interesting again. It seems like many of you would be comfortable developing more advanced data analytics, which is really interesting. And yeah, hopefully our guidance will be useful. Cool.
Yes, it might be useful. There are a few comments in the chat.
Oh.
It might be useful to kind of expand on some of them, I guess, now. So Thomas Foster was saying around the context, and depending on the context, how comfortable or confident you would feel. Thomas, I don't know if you want to sort of elaborate on that here, or we can always talk about it in the discussion later.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point about it very much depending on the context, and I think something that the guidance will definitely draw out as well. And there's many different kind of things to think about during that development. Cool. I will move on unless there's any other questions or comments. So yeah, I will just present the skeleton guidance that we've developed. So we basically collated the research we've done so far to develop the skeleton, which basically outlines a structure for the guidance. So the structure goes as follows. There's 4 parts. There'll be an introduction to the guidance, which will outline kind of why it's important, the purpose of it, and talk to things about the scope, definitions, who the audience is, and how the guidance relates to legal frameworks. The second section talks, or is a bit of an introduction to data ethics. So again, defines data ethics, but also outlines why it's important, and kind of why public trust is really important when local government are exploring and developing data analytics. We'll also outline some different ethical principles and relate them specifically to children's social care. So ones in particular here are around value and benefit, fairness, transparency, and accountability. So these are things around kind of maintaining the trust of families, helping to improve the provision of social care, and thinking about sharing information appropriately. The third section is an introduction to data analytics. So the aim of this is to give audiences a kind of base level understanding of what data analytics is and how it works. So it will provide a summary of the research around the opportunities and risks for the use of data analytics in children's social care. And then we'll kind of introduce and outline different use cases that might be relevant across the provision of social care. And I think Dave will talk to that on the next slide. And the guidance itself, which is the kind of final section, but the kind of most important one, will take a development lifecycle approach. So there'll be an exploratory and problem identification phase at the beginning, which will then move to a design, development, testing, deployment, and monitoring. So the guidance won't provide answers, but it will identify key questions that local authorities should kind of consider and answer at each stage so that they can demonstrate that they've taken a responsible approach. There will also be explainers and resources that will help local authorities to answer some of those questions, particularly where they're kind of technical in nature or cover difficult issues like co-design and evaluation. And there will also be good practice case studies which identify where things have gone well and then also where things might have kind of gone wrong. And there'll be, we'll kind of suggest roles or expertise that should be included at each of those stages and within particular decisions. And finally, there will be at the end of each life cycle stage these kind of move ahead or pause conditions. So this will basically, we hope, help local authorities to feel confident about whether they can proceed to the next stage or whether they might need to do more work. I'll pass over to Dave, and then I think there'll be an opportunity for questions unless anyone has anything now.
Thanks, Jess. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the sort of key risks around children's social care and some of the key themes that we've pulled out in our research so far. We have a relatively long list on this slide, so sort of taking these one by one. So one of the major sort of things that comes up again and again is this issue of poor data quality. So this could be missing, duplicated, inaccurate, outdated data recorded in the system. And when that data is then used to sort of develop some of these tools, that can lead to inaccurate or unrepresentative insights provided by data analytics. A lack of data could also be a problem. So we have sort of sample sizes that are just too small or sort of unbalanced data sets. This may mean you end up making inferences which don't actually aren't really indicative of a sort of underlying causal relationship. And when these analytics tools are then applied in a local authority context, that can mean that local authorities may base strategies, their resource allocation and funding on fundamentally bad information. And in the worst case, if you're using these tools to make decisions about children, such inaccuracies could mean that action is taken, which either misses children and families who are most at risk, or over-intervenes in the lives of families unnecessarily, which can cause sort of unneeded distress to those families, and sort of bigger picture kind of lead to mistrust in the local authority's ability to use these systems, which could undermine future efforts to make better use of data. The second risk outlined here is around sort of uncertain or insecure data sharing or access. So this is where we're dealing with sensitive data, the appropriate sort of security mechanisms, access controls are in place. That can mean personal, very sensitive data about children and families is not properly protected. This could be sort of due to insufficient cybersecurity standards not being implemented, or a lack of rigorous data governance process around handling this data. And in addition, there could be data that's shared that isn't really necessary for a professional or someone else to know about. And obviously, sort of when we're talking about children in particular, this is particularly sort of sensitive data. So there's obviously privacy risks inherent in how that data is sort of managed and accessed. The third point on the slide is around replicating bias. So this is something Jess touched on a little bit, and CDI has already done a lot of work in this space. So fundamentally, data analytics that rely on historical data could replicate the sort of individual, social or cultural biases that have been recorded and then encoded in that data. So CDI published a review into bias in algorithmic decision-making last year, a section of which focuses particularly on local government. And in a children's social care context, historically, child neglect and maltreatment has been correlated with poverty, deprivation. So the majority of those receiving support from children's services come from the most deprived families. And that sort of presents a potential risk that you could sort of, you could sort of propagate biases against those demographic groups when you sort of apply data analytics processes. Next on this list, so there could be this idea that data analytics is perceived as kind of a silver bullet that's going to fix everything, and so not be implemented without appropriate scrutiny. So this could mean that a local authority adopting some of these techniques could feel overconfident in their approach, perhaps be unwilling to challenge the insights, deferring to an insight that's generated over an analytics system of their own professional opinion. It could also mean that there is insufficient governance and assurance. So, for example, not having appropriate sort of robust evaluation and testing procedures, which again could use of data analytics, which is inaccurate or suboptimal, and really should be abandoned The next point is around sort of a lack of transparency around the use of data analytics. So there's a real risk there that you could decrease public confidence, particularly when things go wrong. And then sort of talking about designing systems, it's really important to keep sort of the practitioners and sort of the children and families who are ultimately going to be affected by these systems in mind. So one thing we found is a lack of engagement with frontline practitioners and managers can mean that data analytics tools aren't designed with those practitioners in mind. So that can mean you develop a system that doesn't actually meet a user need, or which may be sort of difficult to integrate into their everyday practice. So, for example, there's one thing sort of having a bad model, but you might have a really good model. If it was used in a really good way, could lead to better outcomes for children. But if that's sort of presented to frontline workers through an interface which isn't designed well, or is overly complex or cumbersome, you can imagine those sort of practitioners pushing back against using that tool, which means we're sort of leading to poorer outcomes for children. So in these circumstances, the uptake and use of analytics isn't sustained. This can mean that sort of money is wasted, and in some cases, data analytics has developed insights on things like re-referral levels, but in practice that's not been needed, as re-referral rates are low, and sort of front door teams and social workers are able to rely on their own expertise. So again, it's obviously really important to think through, what are the actual challenges that we can and should solve with these tools, and sort of not doing data analytics for the sake of it. I think the final point in this rather long list is around sort of a lack of expertise. So thinking here about sort of technical expertise, access or time for training, and sort of a lack of funding, that can all mean that there are problems with either the tools themselves, or those using the tools don't understand to sort of a sufficient level how to sort of make best use of the insight those tools generate. And sort of in that scenario, that can mean that those practitioners using the tools might stop using it and switch off, basically. And again, on the sort of flip side of that, there is this risk that you could sort of overly defer to the system without being able to properly sort of critically assess the insights that it generates. So there was that's sort of a long list of some of the risks that we're thinking about as we consider the guidance, and that kind of leads to a number of key themes which we sort of view as being crucial to demonstrating a responsible approach to developing and deploying data analytics tools, and so addressing some of those risks above. I'm not going to go through all of these, as I think we would run out of time, but I would just want to talk through a few of them, which are probably particularly relevant for this audience. So namely data quality, evaluation and testing, mitigating bias, and procuring third-party expertise. So on data quality, I imagine most people on this call sort of recognize the importance of this. It's kind of a term that gets bandied about a lot, and we want our guidance to kind of unpack this a bit more, so that sort of issues around data quality can be considered in a more practical way. So as Jess mentioned, we aim to have these sort of series of explainers. So we would have, for example, a data quality explainer, where we sort of would define data quality in terms of data that's complete, accurate, recent, and sort of then outline ways in which local authorities might be able to assess for data quality, and sort of signposting to existing resources such as the ONS's data quality framework. This will also suggest ways that local authorities could improve data quality. So for example, appropriate training with those workers who are inputting data to sort of information management systems, and things around sort of having appropriate data standards, or adopting sort of appropriate tools to be able to automate sort of certain aspects of inputting data into a system in a consistent way. And we'll also look to just try and make things a bit more practical, like give good examples of good practice So, you know, where there are sort of examples of local authorities doing this particularly well, try to draw some of those out so we can kind of learn lessons from each other. The second key theme I was going to touch on is around evaluation and testing. So again, we would have an explainer around this aspect, which would describe the importance of setting quantifiable outcomes and objectives at the beginning of each project, and sort of as the project progresses, collecting relevant data that can then be used to measure and evaluate the effectiveness of the product that's been developed. So we'll look to define what we mean by effectiveness, and think about how that can differ in a sort of risk-based approach. So thinking about sort of high and low risk use cases, what do we have to do to sort of measure effectiveness in a rigorous way? This will also outline different methods for evaluation and testing. So that could include how local authorities might work with, for example, academics to sort of provide independent evaluation of projects. And again, include sort of good practice examples of how to validate tools, such as doing a noise audit or using sort of things like synthetic data to supplement data sets. And this will also like outline ways for local authorities to invite feedback and challenge on their work from a whole variety of sort of important stakeholders, so including peers, academics, civil society groups, as well as things like good practice for publishing relevant sort of technical specifications on things like GitHub, sharing across local authority networks, and sharing in their local area with sort of key academics and stakeholders. And I'll then move on to mitigating bias. So again, as mentioned, this would build on our work in our review into algorithmic bias, but in a children's social care context. So define what we mean by bias and fairness in a data-driven system. Explain the different ways that bias can enter into such a system via sort of historical data collection, sort of design, and also like human decision making about sort of what information ends up in that system. We then sort of explain how data analytics can perpetuate bias, but also how it can be used to identify biases and potentially mitigate some of them. So we've sort of looked to outline different technical, cultural, organizational ways in which bias could be mitigated, and the importance of doing a sort of equality impact assessment to help identify where biases might exist. And finally on this, it will sort of highlight the importance of collecting demographic data. So I think this is an area which our bias review highlights as being particularly challenging, as people obviously have concerns about collecting sort of protected characteristic data. So we want to sort of outline best practice for doing that so that it can be used to monitor outcomes for bias, and potentially then make interventions that help to mitigate some of that bias as well. And moving on to the final theme on this that I wanted to discuss, which was around engaging and procuring third-party expertise. So in this section, we want to note the sort of importance of understanding data maturity and in-house skills at the very beginning of a project, and then sort of using those to highlight some of the trade-offs between procuring services from third parties versus developing systems in-house, and summarize some of the relevant advice about procuring data-driven tools, and sort of how to integrate external expertise and consultants into a process inside a local authority. We want to outline some of the good practice when procuring. So yeah, how do you sort of integrate a third party into a local authority team where it's working? And the part of the agreement for the company that is being procured will be to sort of provide relevant training and upskilling for the data teams and relevant frontline staff and senior leaders, to ensure that, you know, once a sort of external party has developed a system, that it can be used appropriately by people within the local authority, and is sort of sustainable over time. And I think at that point, we're going to move to the next slide, Jess. Cool, thanks. Sorry, I'm just switching between tabs. So then just on the audience for the guidance. So we've suggested a number of different sort of audiences. So the most important ones being senior leaders, data teams, social worker teams, legal and information governance teams, as well as multi-agency support outside local authority. So they all have different roles in the development of data analytics. Within the guidance itself, we want to sort of suggest roles and expertise around who should be in the room where specific decisions are being discussed and made. So we might suggest a project team who would develop data analytics to sort of help drive the project forward and identify specific roles or expertise which would be needed in that process. What we also want to do is signpost key sections of the guidance or sort of external resources to the appropriate audience. So rather than, we don't just want this to be a 100-page PDF that nobody ever reads, but rather sort of be able to guide people through the guidance in a really effective way. So you can sort of relevant sort of data teams or social workers can get to the particular sections that might be most relevant to them. And then finally on this slide, we're just going to touch a little bit more on this risk-based approach. So we will introduce different uses of data analytics and then identify factors that might increase or decrease risk. So this could include the scale of the project. So for example, how many children and families could be affected by the system, or say the complexity of the analysis. So sort of broadly speaking, a sort of predictive analytics system is likely to sort of be a more complex task than a more simple kind of descriptive system. Especially, and that, there might be added risk there if we're sort of identifying specific individuals. So we want to enable local authorities to thoroughly consider the different components that contribute to the risk of implementing a particular use case and help draw out any trade-offs that might be involved when considering different approaches. And then, just at the bottom of this slide, we've kind of given a few examples of what we might consider to be a low risk, medium risk, or high risk use case. So in the low risk case, we have comparing the numbers of children referred to children's services with poor mental health to those referred to other RLAs in order to understand how other local authorities provide services that improve mental health. Medium risk, profiling children in care to understand some of the factors that might lead to a child being in care in order to then develop early intervention services that can help address some of those factors. And finally, a potentially higher risk use case would be sort of using predictive risk modeling that identifies children who are at risk of sexual abuse in order to support a social worker's assessment of risk. So yeah, this is something we hope to flesh out as we sort of develop the guidance over the next couple of months. And I think at this point, I'm going to hand back to Jess.
Cool. Thanks, Dave. So this is a final question before we go into breakout room discussions. So I guess an opportunity to answer any questions that are in the chat, or if people want to ask questions now.
There was a question came from Juliet. I don't know if you can hear me, but Dave, can you say a little bit more about data sharing? Because there's quite a few people interested in that.
Yes, sorry, I haven't had the chat open. Was there a particular aspect of data sharing?
It was simply that you listed it as one of the areas that you were interested in. Wasn't one of the ones that you elaborated in more detail, and I think some of our audience might be interested in that. mean, I presume you're talking data sharing. Are you talking data sharing just with external organisations, for instance, or are you actually within the government? It can be even within services sharing between them?
Sorry, I'm happy to jump in. So I think with the data sharing, we're focusing specifically on some of like the privacy and security risks that that come up in that case. But I guess essentially the guidance recognises that data sharing is kind of a crucial part of being able to do data analytics. And so just kind of making sure that the kind of essential framework and bones are there. So whether that's data sharing agreements with partners, just kind of, yeah, and that kind of thing. Sorry, yeah, Dave, you can also add anything.
Yeah, no, that's useful. I think I would just add, so yeah, sort of approaching it from that privacy and security perspective. And the centre has also done recently a couple of pieces of work around sort of, I suppose, data sharing, data access more generally, and sort of appropriate both sort of technical and governance mechanisms for doing that. So we recently published a guide on sort of using privacy enhancing technologies to sort of better enable greater data access, but in like a privacy preserving way. And we also recently published a report around sort of the use of different data intermediaries to kind of achieve the same thing. So yeah, I think what we'll look to do in the guidance as well is sort of signpost to those resources, as well as sort of stuff around appropriate sort of data protection, anonymization that's been published by the ICO. Yeah, and try to provide those sort of both, I guess, technical and organizational mechanisms that can be used to sort of have greater confidence and as well as like greater security and privacy when sharing data.
Thanks, Dave. I'm sorry to interrupt. We better move on because we're running behind schedule now and we'll run out of time if we're not careful. Jess, do you want to just introduce the breakouts?
Yeah, of course. So I think we'll be moving into 6 breakout rooms for the next 15 minutes. And we'd like everyone to think about the work that we've just presented and I guess some specific questions that I've just outlined on this slide here. So thoughts on, yeah, the work that we've presented, your thoughts on the audience and whether we've kind of broadly got that right, our approach to risk, whether you think it's a useful resource or if there's any other things or issues that you'd like the guidance to address or include, and whether you've developed data analytics which has been kind of beneficial, and if, yeah, and just to hear a bit more about those. So I think, am I going to pass over to Kailash to do the breakout rooms?
That's right.
Cool. I thought I had done that. There. Okay, cool. So mostly a little bit, so that's good. The next question is, do you think that guidance could help you or colleagues to better understand how to develop a data analytics responsibly? Cool. That's also really good for us to hear. The next question, and apologies that this is quite small on the screen, but which of these themes would you like more information about in a follow-up seminar? And you can tick all of them that apply. So these kind of broadly follow the key themes that we'll be focusing on in the guidance. So on co-production, testing and evaluation, governance and oversight, legal requirements, mitigating bias, training and upskilling, procuring and engaging third-party expertise, data quality, communicating publicly, and data use and sharing. So a fairly even spread there. Interesting. Okay. Training and upskilling seems to be the one that's kind of most interesting, as well as data use and sharing, which we've touched on a little bit. Cool. And then what would be the most useful thing for the guidance to include? And again, tick all that apply. So case study examples from other local authorities, checklists, overviews of relevant research, explanation of why data is important, links to further resources, diagrams and infographics, or other. Okay, cool. I think case study examples seems to be the most important, but again, a fairly even spread, which is interesting. Okay, and I think this might be the final question. So how would you like to be engaged in this project in the future? So are you interested to attend seminars and discuss key issues in the guidance? Would you like us to share resources so that you can comment and feed in? Are you interested in only the final resource? Would you like to work with us to apply the guidance or part of it to projects that you're working on, or not be engaged? Okay, that's interesting. We'll definitely take that away, so thank you. Oh, sorry. Final question. How would you like to use, how likely would you be to use this guidance or recommend that it is used? Okay, that's also really great. So yeah, I guess just before I hand back to Tim to do a final summary, just wanted to thank you all for your time and for all of your contributions. They've been really interesting. So the discussions that we've had today will kind of feed into the guidance that we're drafting. We'll share the results of the polls with you, and can also resend the slides as well. And yeah, we'll make sure that we follow up on some specific like themes and issues, and we hopefully will come back and run another seminar on those things that you've said that you would find particularly interesting. I suppose in the meantime, do let us know if you have any questions. Our emails are in the slides, which will be sent around. And yeah, thank you so much to the LGA for hosting us. It's been really great. I'll pass back to Tim.
Thanks very much indeed to Jessica and to Dave and to Lara for filling in this 75 minutes. I can never believe how much we get through in such a short time, and it's a format that seems to be working very well. Very, very important subject, good contributions from everybody. So thanks everyone for all your time. And Jessica and Dave particularly are working with us with this network. So I'm sure they'll be interacting through our network to discuss further with you and to invite you to those sessions and so on when they get to the next stage. So thank you very much for joining us. We'll plan to share all of the resources from this in the next 2 to 3 days, as we usually do, and we'll send you a group message from the network to tell you where to find that. There's a short survey as usual that I tend to put out on the chat, or someone does. I put on a few minutes ago, so if you can see that link and just give us feedback, and we'll remind you again if you can't get that link, because the feedback is so important as we continue to drive more webinars forward. And really, I think that's about it. Continue to discuss and converse online with the network. We're still keen to get things moving forward. We desperately would like your feedback and ideas on what you'd like us to be covering in these webinars, be it training, briefing sessions, or speakers from the CDI and others like this, or have representatives from councils giving examples of what they're doing in the analytics space. So please, please talk to us and guide us as to what we can do to help as a sector to move forward. So that's it. We weren't that much late. Well, we're 5 minutes. So thank you for your time, and have a good afternoon.